Hey there, and welcome to the Sudo Show, brought to you by the Destination Linux Network. Today, we have an exciting interview with Peter Zaistev, founder and CEO of Percona. We discuss open source, software licensing, and all things databases. All that and more on this episode of the Sudo Show. Welcome to the Sudo Show, your home for all things enterprise open source. I'm Eric, the IT guy, and today we're going to share an interview with a true open source advocate, Peter Zaistev. He's the founder of Percona and has a real passion for helping his customers lower cost, maximize uptime, and avoid vendor lock-in. And of course, I'll be joined by my favorite co-host, Brandon Johnson. But before we jump into our interview, I've got to tell you about our sponsors over at Bitwarden. Bitwarden is the easiest and safest way for individuals, teams, and business organizations to store, share, and sync sensitive data. Bitwarden works across all your devices, from mobile, desktop, and even browser plugins. It's 100% open source, so you know their code can be trusted. Bitwarden is free to get started, but you can get upgraded features for just $10 a year. That's right, $10 a year. This gives you features like 1 gig of encrypted file storage, 2-step login with YubiKey, Vault Health Reports, and Bitwarden's new Emergency Access. It couldn't be any easier to get started with Bitwarden. Just head on over to bitwarden.com/DLN to get started today. And a sincere thank you to Bitwarden for sponsoring the Sudo Show. As I mentioned in the intro today, we are excited to bring on Peter Zaistev. Peter is the founder and CEO of Percona. He is an accomplished public speaker, mentor, author, and member of a number of boards from various database and open source organizations. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So, Peter, just tell us a little about yourself. How did you get started in technology? Was it planned or just something you fell into?
Oh, well, that's an interesting question. I was thinking about that because this particular thing is not asked that often. I think when I was like a very small kid, I wanted to be something like, bus driver when I was 5 because that sounded, like a cool thing to do. But then I think after, 12 years or later when I discovered computers, right, I knew I will do something with them, right? I didn't know what I will go into databases, open source, right, or even more run the company in this space. But I think that was a love at the first sight, if you will, for me. And if it kind of sounds strange why it's kind of so late, 12 years old, I was growing up in the Soviet Union, right, and in our world where computers have not been as ubiquitous as in the United States at the same time and age.
Technology was actually my second career path. Well, it was actually my second choice in career paths. The first was going to be a fighter pilot in the U.S. Air Force, and then I shattered my knee. So, here I am.
Wow. I mean, what pilots needs for, right? I mean, I understand your sharp eyes, right? And, quick reaction to click a missile launch button, but knees.
Apparently, the rudder is pretty important in a jet, and there's some concerns as to the integrity of my kneecap after my accident. But hey, I can't complain about the life that I've lived since then. In fact, you mentioned you didn't plan on going into databases. So how did that come about?
I think I get interested in the database just gradually ranging from a college experience. And then my first startup I was involved in was a company called Spylog. We were something like a Google Analytics of, Russia, late 90s. And this was extremely data-driven application, right? You need to really process a lot of stuff. And really, while I was CTO in that project, I really spent a lot of my time messing with databases, solving database problem, and that's how I kind of get into that field, if you like, right? So we were very early MySQL user at that time, right? And that's how I get connected to folks at MySQL team, right? There was kind of that crazy Russian guy who would write say, hey, here's a bug, fix it. Well, I would continue saying things, but you say you're a family-friendly show, so let me end the sentence there.
I think we can infer from context.
So, Peter, you're a published author. I mean, people won't be able to see this, but this book, I happen to notice this. in your background. That High Performance MySQL. This is the second edition. I have the latest one, but this book saved my career. So first, thank you. I did a lot of MySQL work at the beginning of my career. It's probably still my favorite book around MySQL. So first, thank you on that. I really do. Like, this was a fantastic book. Do you have anything new in the works around whether that's MySQL or Postgres?
Not book-wise, right? Like, unfortunately, when you are CEO, right, and you have this task of running the company, the time to kind of like geek out and spend time on technical things typically doesn't come in the large enough quantities so you can focus and write a book, right? So I have transitioned to kind of like a smaller medium. You can find me still blogging, doing the presentation, right, and webinars, but I haven't had the time to write a book in the recent years.
So you're busy as CEO of Percona, and we'll dive into that here in just a minute. But you also serve on a number of different boards and different organizations. Why don't you talk about some of the different groups you work with?
Well, let me start probably with why, right? So from my standpoint, yes, I happen to run Percona, but I am very passionate about pushing the boundaries of open source, and especially in the open source database space. So then I am finding some entrepreneurs, right, or just developers having the open source project. I am always happy to help, right? In certain cases, just hey, can you folks maybe help promote it through social media, right, or maybe have them come and speak at our conference, Percona Live, right, or maybe offer some advice here and there. Then there are also some organizations where I am in advisory position, and also besides Percona, I had help with co-founding some other organizations out there as well. I think the most interesting company besides Percona would be a company called Altinity, which is a company around the ClickHouse technology, right? And the ClickHouse is this really kind of super fast open source column store, right? Which is really kind of a very different market, right, compared to MySQL and Postgres, but that's also something I was able to contribute to.
Peter, we've had a number of founders as guests on the show. How would one of our listeners know if they'd be successful as an entrepreneur? That's a loaded question, but we've asked this of one of our other guests. I'd like to hear your answer on this as well.
Of course. The first, I would say that I believe that there are very many paths to be a successful entrepreneur, right? There is not a one path. And probably one kind of bad thing you could do, right, is to compare yourself with maybe some other stars you have, right? And say, well, you know what, I am not like as creative as Steve Jobs, right? Or maybe not have such a great public speaking skills, right? Or for somebody else, right? If you really look at the company successes, you would know what there are company founders success which come in all shapes and sizes. I think the two big things which are important from my standpoint. One is passion about whatever you are trying to be successful with, right? Because if you just, don't care, if you say, well, I mean, I have no passion, but I think maybe that's a good way to make money, it's very unlikely to be successful. Their other thing is what they're running a business is in the end a team sport, right? And you would find some entrepreneurs, they are successful as a solo entrepreneurs, right? The others would be like a founding team of two or more people. But then as you look at the company a couple of years in, right, you would a successful company that is, right, you would always see entrepreneur with a team, because nobody is good with everything, right? And nobody, even if you can be good at everything, you don't have time to do everything, right? So really finding those people to supplement your weaknesses, if you like, and delegate and trust in them to do their job in that area of responsibility you assign them, I think is very important.
And the startup culture is something I've really found interesting. And if I were maybe a little bit crazier, maybe I'd try myself someday. But like you were talking about, I haven't found that need, that gap in our industry that I'm really passionate about. I found that working with folks like Red Hat or the open source community has really been where I like to find myself, just because I can draw on the energy of others, and just like the show is an extension of that. Being able to come on here, meet folks like yourself, and share your story. That's something I'm very passionate about. So while I may not ever start my own company, I love the idea of working with others with their own company.
Yeah. Well, let me also say this, right? I think one of these interesting challenges, right, and I think that especially how it applies to their open source community, is this kind of a growing cult of a Silicon Valley mold entrepreneur, right? And what that means is you have this kind of a great $10 billion idea. You go ahead, you raise, gazillion dollar of venture capital, then you work 200-hour weeks, right, for, whatever years, and then boom, right, you are rich and you can retire on your private island, right? And, right, I think that is, maybe we have some of those examples, right, and they get a lot of press, but it doesn't have to be what entrepreneurship is about and what you don't have to strive for, right? Like, for example, very often you would hear about almost like kind of derogatory reference about like a lifestyle company. There is nothing wrong with that, right? I don't think there is wrong with entrepreneurs, especially in the open source space, who say, hey, you know what, I want to make a difference, and that is my main point. Maybe it's not going to be $1 billion company, but I'm going to be making a difference, right? And one of the people I respect very much is the guy named Dr. Richard Heep, right? You haven't heard about him. Well, maybe you haven't. He is the founder of SQLite. Right?
Oh, yeah.
And what is interesting about the SQLite is, while it's not super known product in this case, it is everywhere. Right, your browser, your phone, right, majority of the Internet of Things devices out there have maybe multiple copies of SQLite embedded, right, in this case. But he is not kind of as famous or as rich, right, as many other companies. But if you think about the value that SQLite provided, I think that's not less, maybe even more than $1 billion plus valuations companies out there like Mongo, Elastic, right, and some others.
So, kind of dovetailing off of entrepreneurship, your company, what was the need that you saw in the space that brought you to found your organization? Like, there's several open source companies out there supporting databases, whether that's like Enterprise DB, Mongo, etc. What was it that you saw in the market, and what are you trying to fill?
Yes. So I would say what Percona was more of a journey than this kind of like a grand vision which came to me during the sleep, right, or something like that. Before Percona, I was working on in MySQL AB, right? That's kind of original team behind MySQL. And then I started out there. The team was less than 50 people in size. And this was what I would call like a romantic open source company, right? In a sense, what we were really out there to make a difference, right? To really unseat Oracle, really to be very helpful to our customers and so on and so forth, right? Gradually, though, their MySQL ended up going kind of traditional route. It's, raised their venture capital. And a lot of that gradually become, okay, how do we really maintain that growth curve, what our VCs expect from that? And there have been a number of compromises to that in terms of putting their this kind of monetization interest in front of the customer goals, right? And I found myself gradually, distancing myself from a company. I remember in the first years at MySQL, I would be telling we took this decision, we do that, we do them. And then I noticed I'm saying them. Oh, MySQL, we did this, we did that, right? For me, that was kind of interesting realization what I don't associate myself with that company anymore, right? Because I cannot support their decision. And that obviously was the time for me to leave. So I decided to do what I knew how to do and start with service company around MySQL ecosystem. With our main promise at that was really what we will be very much customer focused. We are putting our customers and we are doing what's right for a customer, right? And this is something which remains our key value at that time, even at this point. Like one example, when people ask me like, what is one of your proud points of Percona, I give an example when some customers come to us and say, hey, we wanted to migrate the database from Oracle to MySQL. And we look at that, say, hey, you know what, that is going to be super hairy, super expensive, and and unlikely successful, right? As a consultant, we actually could have sold them that project, milk them, like probably for a couple of years, and they say, well, it didn't work out, right? Instead, we say, hey, you know what, you probably shouldn't be doing that, right? It will would make us a lot of money if we sign you up, but you are better off not doing that project, right? And these deal in a separate deals, right? Then I have a quantifiable ways when we are putting the customer first, right? Even if it's not into our financial advantages, is a moment they're the most proud of Percona. So we started with professional services at Percona, and gradually we transitioned to cover multiple databases and offer a full portfolio, right? We have software right now, we have support, managed services, you name it. Now, you also said, well, there are other open source database companies, right? Here is an interesting thing, is what majority of all other open source companies are not really open source companies. They're typically open core companies, or it is kind of source available or something like that. Like you mentioned, MongoDB, for example. Well, MongoDB a few years back ditched the open source license, right, and went to source available license called SSPL, right? If you look at the Enterprise DB, while Enterprise DB is a great contributor to PostgreSQL ecosystem, right, and to contribute to PostgreSQL core a lot, the product they sell is not 100% open source, right? It includes a lot of proprietary pieces, so it's PostgreSQL based, right? Or it's kind of open source based rather than completely open source. What makes Percona different is what our software is open source. Everything what we write, we distribute to customers is distributed under open source license. We don't do open core. We don't do eventual open source or other stuff, right? Well, to be fair, when we have a Percona's version of MongoDB, we distribute that under SSPL, which is source available, not open source license. But this is not because of our choice, right? That is just because, well, when upstream changes the license, you even have to follow or you have to fork, right? And, trying to fork when you are having on the other side, many hundreds of people worth of engineering team, that is not very practical approach.
Right now, Percona, at least on your website, and correct me if I'm wrong, are supporting at least 3 open source databases. That's got to be a difficult task. I mean, supporting 3 massive projects like MySQL, Postgres, and Mongo. How do you decide how you're going to focus your development resources? Like, it sounds like you are contributing upstream. So how do you decide where to focus development resources when you need to?
Yes, well, indeed, we support MySQL, MongoDB, and Postgres, right? And also you can count sometimes MariaDB, right, wherever you want that to count as a part of MySQL ecosystem or as a separate database. And I would say our contribution is different among the different ecosystem, right? We by far contributed the most to the MySQL, right? That was the first technology we added, and then kind of MongoDB, which we've been doing now for probably like about 5 years. And then PostgreSQL is much more recent for us, right? We also look at the needs of a community, which are not same everywhere. Like, for example, if you look at backup solution, we have created backup solution kind of years ago, Percona Extra Backup for MySQL. More recently, we created Percona Backup for MongoDB because MongoDB does not have a good open source backup solution, right? Only proprietary. At the same time, in the PostgreSQL space, which is PG back REST, and there is actually whole other set of open source backups which we simply use as a part of solution for our customers. And we apply this idea to all our products. We want to, we understand we are a small company compared to ecosystem at large, and we want to be very focused to understand where the gaps are and where we can provide the maximum value, right? And that is where we focus our resources. And also, of course, what our customers are telling us.
So I think we'd all agree that we live in a cloud native era. Kubernetes is kind of king of this particular castle. So how do you feel the databases fit into this new paradigm?
Yeah, well, I think this is very interesting. If you look at the databases is some of the more sensitive part of your infrastructure, right? And for a good reason, right? Because this kind of state needs extreme care how you work with it, right? Because if you think about your web application, for example, if it kind of crashes, well, you can always just kind of spin it up, right? If your database crashes and some of your updates lost, right, or data gets corrupted, well, that is a much bigger problem, right? And with that, database and DBA always are kind of very conservative, right? Like I remember, more than a decade ago now when virtualization was coming along, people also would, the database folks would be also the last to want to run database in virtualized environment, right? Especially mission critical ones, right? The same happens in Kubernetes, right? And I think right now we are at the stage there are fears of old Kubernetes, of a state of a Kubernetes, 3 years ago or something, is a more important kind of driver than reality, right? We're working with some customers which are running mission critical database on Kubernetes and are quite successful with those, while at the same time, you see the same kind of customers telling us, oh my gosh, well, that is absolutely impossible. Nobody in their right mind would run those workloads in a Kubernetes, right? So if you look at from my standpoint, right, and this is, I think, is interesting for many dimensions for database adoption, is we geeks often tend to think about the technical aspects of a product, right? But this is not all of it, right? The human aspect is often much more important, right? And we need to look at, okay, what is the team thinking, right? Is team comfortable with Kubernetes? Do they want to make it work? Or do they want to prove what it cannot be done so they are left alone, not using Kubernetes? Because if that is what they want to do, they will find a way to make it so it doesn't work. If that is a team situation, well, then maybe we need to have other teams adopting that, right? To have some, software approach to say, hey guys, maybe you want to write it to try to CI/CD instead of your kind of mission critical production first, and then as you get confidence with that, you can graduate to a kind of mission critical production. Yeah, so that's how we would approach it.
I lived that as a recovering systems administrator. I lived exactly what you were talking about. When virtualization started to make its way out into the world, and when everything was starting to get virtualized, I have never had to fight and beg so hard than to get database administrators to give up their physical hardware. The company that I spent the most time on this virtualization project with ended up, we virtualized literally everything else in the data center. Applications, backup servers, utility boxes, load balancers, everything else got virtualized. And then we went back to the DBAs, and the most we could get them to budge in that calendar year was to virtualize non-production. And then after a few months, when hardware was starting to come off lease or as older hardware was starting to go out of warranty, finally it took managerial pressure to convince them that, look, nothing bad has happened in our virtual environments. In fact, our reliability is up. Everything's working fine. The world will not end. We're not crossing any streams here, so we have to virtualize the database. It was really funny to then watch as this cloud native transition has started happening and seeing those same people swear up and down, databases will never, ever run in Kubernetes. It's just absolutely not possible. And now here we are.
Well, let's mention, I think, some other interesting aspect in this case, right? And this goes in the databases, Kubernetes and the cloud providers, right? Because if you look at your custom applications, cloud vendors now understand that Kubernetes are Kubernetes 1, and that is what people would use to deploy it. But Kubernetes is pretty much commodity, right? To getting close to that in terms of what Kubernetes is between different cloud providers. But where cloud providers try to innovate and push you is using their proprietary database technologies. Like many of you can say, well, you know what, you run your application in a Kubernetes, but instead of storing data in Kubernetes, which is not a good idea, maybe you use Redshift or DynamoDB or Amazon Aurora, right? Or Google Spanner or BigQuery, right? And guess what is common among all those services, right? These are things which are not open source, right? And which are intended to lock you into a particular cloud vendor, right? So I think that is another reason why there is maybe more FUD in terms of scariness of running database in Kubernetes where it should be.
The whole premise of getting your data into the public cloud and then it stays forever. Essentially, like you adopt an Amazon database as a service solution and you're not leaving, at least not anytime soon. What's your thoughts around that? Like our day job, we're talking about hybrid cloud. We've talked about that in other episodes, but when I say that, I mostly mean like least resistant way of data portability. What's your thoughts on stuff like that?
You are totally right, right in this case. I mean, getting data to a single cloud can be extremely risky, right? Both from kind of giving the pricing power you get to a vendor, or let's say some other concerns, right? Being that the decisions of the cloud vendors, or even maybe things like government sanctions. Like, for example, recently you may have heard about the case of Amazon decided to cancel account on a Parler application, right? And again, I'm not going to judge whether what Parler was doing kind of good or bad, right? But the point is they have a service stopped on them with a very short notice, right? Without them even kind of being able to get the data from Amazon quickly enough. Right, and the same may happen is, for example, because of some government sanctions, right, or whatever other stuff, right. So from my standpoint, I think it's a very good idea to go hybrid cloud or multi-cloud. Even if you say, hey, Amazon works kind of wonderful for my production, maybe you can make sure you have kind of streaming backup going on to some other cloud or maybe your data center you control. So in a worst case scenario, you can recover. Whereas I think even kind of more advantages, right, is this kind of a multi-cloud deployment, which some technologies like a PlanetScale support, when you can say, well, instead of just having my data in one Kubernetes cluster, I can deploy that both in Google and Amazon and Azure at the same time, right? So if one of the clouds goes down completely, right, for whatever reason, I still can continue operate.
One of the examples I give is probably one of the best known in open source was shortly after Microsoft acquired GitHub. GitLab, actually, a lot of their stuff was hosted on Microsoft Azure. And so they decided to hit the escape hatch and go to GCP. I believe that was right. Eric, you worked at GitLab, I think, actually, during this transition.
Yep, and they just completed the transition when I started working there. In fact, the whole hashtag move to GitLab movement was why I ended up getting hired on there. Today's interview is brought to you by none other than DigitalOcean. DigitalOcean offers the simplest, most developer-friendly cloud platform. You can get started on DigitalOcean for free with a $100 credit by going to do.co/DLN. They provide a competitive edge for your business while having an easy-to-use interface. DigitalOcean provides one of the most reliable platforms with over 100,000 developer teams worldwide and offer 4 nines of uptime. Think a service like this would come with a complex pricing scale? Not at all. Enjoy DigitalOcean's flat monthly fees so you'll always know what you're spending. DigitalOcean offers world-class customer support with tech-savvy technicians and even around-the-clock support for premium subscribers. Couple that with Duo's security-compliant infrastructure, and you have the perfect formula for hosting your blog, hobbyist site, or the enterprise-scale application. DigitalOcean keeps getting better and better while still keeping the same easy-to-use UI, and who can beat their amazing library of APIs? That is why we're so excited to share their service with you. Just head on over to do.co/DLN to get your own $100 credit to try out all their awesome features, and thank you to DigitalOcean for sponsoring the Sudo Show. Now, back to the interview.
I wanted to also talk about the future of open source. When we talk about public cloud, occasionally think open source. I mean, with Amazon, occasionally will participate in open source technologies, not just take it and productize it, like they just did the open source, their implementation of Elastic, for example. With public cloud, kind of taking over, what do you see as the futures of open source? I mean, especially like with licensing changes, like with Mongo, Redis, etc.
Well, I think that is a very, very interesting thing, right? I see in this case the open source, right? There are really two kinds of open source, right? If you look, and I think this recent developments really split that into much more clearly, right? There is open source, right? Because you can think about that like community open source or SQLite open source, which is focused about, hey, you know what? I want to maximize the value to open source. I want to maximize the collaboration, right? And in this case, the more people take it, right, use it, make your technology accessible, the better it is. And then the other one is kind of much more of a venture-funded commercial open source, where a lot of people started the company and then took the money, in this case, to make money, right? That is the only way of a reason like VCs would give you money, right, to get 10x plus return. And in their case, frankly, they typically don't give a shit about open source, but what they, as a original open source value, but what they see, they care about the open source as a thing which is chosen by the market. If a proprietary software would be still much more accepted, right? Well, that's what they would probably continue going, right? And we see that really happening right now, right? If many of those licenses, you see people going kind of more close, using not completely open source license on one side, and on the other, also people shifting to a more open source license out there. Now, on Amazon, let me give you, I think, is kind of a very interesting example of a reaction to PostgreSQL ecosystem and Elastic ecosystem to Amazon. Because both of them are essentially in the same space, right? There is RDS on Amazon, and there is Elastic on Amazon. And Amazon contributes kind of a little bit, but not a lot to both of the projects, so, right? But how did the PostgreSQL ecosystem took that? They took it, that is fantastic. Because you know what? Because simple Postgres now is available on Amazon or on Azure, right, on GCP, it is fantastic. More people can use Postgres and will love it. On the other hand, from Elastic, you can say, oh my gosh, more people now can use Elastic on Amazon. That means Elastic company will not be able to monetize things as heavily, well, let's do something about that, right? And I like thinking about that as you think about like a small cake and a big cake mentality, right? The PostgreSQL thinking, which I think is right one in the context of an open source, saying, hey, let's focus on making the cake bigger for everybody else. And if a cake is huge, then there is enough space for all of us out there, right? And yes, maybe you're not going to control 95% of a case, right? But you are, going to make a good living still, right? So that is, I think, is a very important thing. Now, I think is also important difference here is if you think about the PostgreSQL, one of the reasons they don't do that because they really can't. There is not a single company which controls PostgreSQL. Why Elastic, of course, can, right? And when big money speaks, then typically those true values of open source mumbo jumbo in the end they go out of a window, right? And things like happen if license change happen.
In your mind, is that the biggest hurdle that open source has to overcome right now? Is it this battle of, like you said, the big money?
Well, in my opinion, investment in open source, they are not that, right? I think while a lot of kind of open source is being kind of created, which is maybe not adherent to full open source values completely, there is also a lot of innovation going to the true open source because of that. What I see there danger is inflation of a term open source, right? Because if you look at what a lot of people are doing out there, like Elastic, so MongoDBs, right? They are preaching, SSPL is just as good as a truly open source license. No, it isn't, right? Or people say, well, but you know what? Amazon Aurora is open source compatible, right? And then open source, right, in this case is used as a marketing term, right, to refer to what is in the substance of the proprietary product, right? And what I see, while somebody who were in the open source for a long time, 10 years, right, or more, they understand all of those differences, right? The new people coming in, they may not understand the difference, right? I think that is a great danger, and I think that is what really open source movement should spend a lot of focus about, is making sure people understand what is a true open source and what is a sort of, wolf in a ship clothing kind of open source.
Mm-hmm. It sounds almost like the natural food movement here in the United States. It's really funny because people want all natural. They don't want processed foods, but because the term is so vague, anyone could put the label of all natural on their product and say that it's natural when it's not really vegan based or organic or whatever the people think they're getting with that term. It's almost the same in the open source world, because you've got open source, you've got open core, you've got all these different offshoots of true open source.
Absolutely. And it's kind of funny you use this example, because I use it also too, right? And what I tell the people, look, we have like two terms, right? There is organic, and organic is actually trademark term, and you need to pass through certain certification to be able to put that label. Natural is not, right? I mean, it may be made from a dog shit, right? But it's still natural, right? It doesn't particularly make it good for you. And that is a problem with an open source, right? But there is open source is like natural.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's not trademark term, and we can talk in this case even like there is sort of like an OSI, right? And we can talk about the OSI certified open source, right? But really, you can call yourself open source, right? And you're not in line with open OSI principles, and what you can expect is maybe only some community members saying, oh, you know what, that is not real open source. But when you speak about those huge companies with billions, tens of $billions of marketing, right, they can crowd down your voice, right, if that's only your voice.
Yeah, there's so many that do not meet the open source definition. And as much as I would, cry about it, I will say cry. I'm like, you're not meeting the open source definition, blah, blah, blah. I think more or less like they're meeting Now, there isn't an open core definition, but they are meeting what I would think is an open core definition. But using the term open source as a marketing term, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, so I would hope what we have more of a standardization out there, right? And I think if you look at the practical open source, that it's not just that, right? When people have an intent to play fast and loose, there are some other examples. Like for example, I've seen the software which will be open source, but it would require very complicated build process, and the build scripts are not open source, right? And the binaries they only give to their customers, right? So it's in theory it is open source, but you know what? Unless you're paying us, you're screwed. Kind of open source.
Mm-hmm.
That also is, maybe trying to meet the letter of the law of the open source without really having the open source spirit.
Exactly, without embracing that spirit. It sounds like what we need to do is we need to almost combat some of this big money, some of these folks that have kind of claimed open source. I mean, just a few months ago, we had a very large company say that open source was their birthright. It sounded like they laid claim to open source. And it's like, that's completely contrary to the spirit of open source.
Yeah.
But they're predominant in the space. And I won't mention their name, but
and they don't make a ton of open source contributions themselves.
No, they really don't.
Yeah. And their core product's proprietary.
Right. So what we need to do almost is pour some money into true open source. Find those projects, find those communities, and find a way to get money to them. And so one of the things that seems to come up on the show quite frequently, actually, is how can we promote these business models that really embrace monetizing open source, whether that's a fund the maintainer or a traditional subscription model, something like a Cloudera or even Red Hat. How do you think we should go about this? Or is there any one right way?
Well, this is, I think, is an interesting state of the industry, not just in open source, about how much of the effort in general in the modern world is spent on selling and marketing, right? Think about, for example, drug research, right? I mean, you would read about what it's from a, cost. Typically, like about maybe 10% goes in terms of, hey, we're actually creating of a drug. The other one is, the rest is full focused on the selling and marketing of that stuff, right? And we almost kind of got used to that idea of what it's not the best things, technology or otherwise win, but which are the most marketed. Like the best thing to win in many businesses is, hey, not to spend in technology, right? Well, maybe to say what you're spending on technology, but to really make sure what you market the hell out of the things, right? And I think their reality goes to that is not just throwing more money on the companies, because frankly, if you as a company choose to follow kind of open source principles and invest a lot of engineering and kind of do good, your profit margins by definition are not going to be, matched, right? Wouldn't be matched, right? But what's sort of like a fake open source companies can do, right? So I think what is more valuable in this case is really educating people about making choices for themselves, right? Kind of learn to, hey, filter out this kind of, noise you have and really understand the ultimate truth, right? And I kind of started talking about I was born kind of in the Soviet Union, right? And what I think is interesting in this kind of case is you have the state kind of, propaganda machine, right? Which can be really compared to what often we see in our space, right? There is like a one, maybe a wrong point of view, right? But it's kind of a definite. But over time, enough people can learn to make decisions for themselves, right? And see that thing, right? And fakeness of it all for what it is, right? So the change can happen.
So, Peter, we've really enjoyed having you on the show today. So if people want to connect with you, where should they go?
Oh, well, I think I'm easy to find. I'm there on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook. You can also go to percona.com and find a bunch of my writings or presentations out there.
Awesome. And if folks want to engage with Percona, how should they get started?
Well, the same thing, right? right? You could probably go to percona.com, and that is where you can find all our software, free and open source, for real, as I mentioned, as well as you can talk to our team to see if we can help you with anything on commercial basics.
Awesome. Of course, all the links to Peter and Percona will be in the show notes. Peter, thank you so much for joining us. We'll have to have you back on the show again real soon.
Okay. Of course. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. As always, your feedback is welcome. Head on over to sudo.show/discuss. If you'd like more of Brandon and I, you can find it over at sudo.show and on social media at sudoshow podcast. You can catch more awesome content over at our network partners, destinationlinux.network. If you want more of Brandon, you can catch him on Twitter at dbrandonjohnson or his website at open-tech.net. And you can follow me at itguyeric on itguyeric.com. Remember, the Sudo Show is your place for all things enterprise open source. Until next time.